Jake Thunderheart's coffee cup shattered against the rocky ground, his weathered hands trembling as he stared at the impossible scene below. The massive Burmese python, 20 feet of deadly muscle, had coiled around Sierra like a living nightmare, squeezing the life from the pregnant grizzly bear he'd watched grow from an orphaned cub. This wasn't supposed to happen in Yellowstone. Chief Windwalker's radio crackled with panicked voices as she witnessed her best ranger frozen in disbelief. The morning silence exploded into Sierra's desperate, choking gasps echoing off the canyon walls. Jake's mind flashed to his mother's funeral 20 years ago, another family member he'd failed to protect. The same helpless rage, the same crushing weight of being too late. "Call for backup!" Chief Windwalker shouted into her radio, her voice breaking with urgency she hadn't felt in 30 years of service, but backup was 40 minutes away. Sierra had maybe tens. Who had brought this killer into their sanctuary? And why was Kodiak, the massive male grizzly, pacing just yards away, watching, waiting, as if he knew something they didn't? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Jake Thunderheart had stood in this same valley, watching Sierra teach her younger cousin how to fish in Obsidian Creek. At 45, Jake carried the quiet dignity of his Lakota grandmother and the steady resolve of 20 years protecting Yellowstone's wilderness. His weathered face told stories of countless dawns spent tracking injured animals. His gentle hands had nursed orphaned cubs back to health, and his patient heart had learned to speak the language of creatures who remembered kindness. Jake lived simply in a small cabin on his ranger's salary of $45,000, sending half his paycheck to his elderly Aunt Mary on the Pine Ridge Reservation. His mother, Running Deer, had been killed by poachers when Jake was 25, shot down like an animal while she gathered medicinal herbs in the sacred Black Hills. That loss had driven him to Yellowstone, seeking healing in the wilderness his mother had loved. Sierra wasn't just another bear to Jake. 8 years ago, he'd found her as a 6-month-old cub, starving beside her mother's body, another victim of an illegal snare. Her left ear bore a distinctive notch from that old trap, a scar that made her instantly recognizable among the park's grizzly population. Jake had bottle-fed her for weeks before releasing her back into the wild at age 2, but she'd never forgotten his scent, his voice, the man who'd saved her life. Now she was 8 years old, pregnant with her first cubs, and mated to Kodiak, a 12-year-old alpha male who'd somehow learned to recognize Jake's forest green Ranger truck. Kodiak was massive even by Grizzly standards, weighing nearly 800 pounds, but he possessed an intelligence that unsettled some visitors. The bear seemed to understand that Jake was different from other humans, allowing him to observe from respectful distances that would send any other person running for their lives. Chief Sarah Windwalker, half Navajo and nearing retirement at 62, had mentored Jake since his first day at Yellowstone. She understood his special connection with the wildlife, but worried about the bureaucrats in Washington who viewed emotional attachments as professional weakness. Recent budget cuts threatened ranger positions, and politicians questioned whether soft conservation methods were worth the taxpayer investment. Dr. Elena Ravenfeather had arrived 3 months ago as the park's new veterinarian, her Cherokee heritage and passionate dedication to wildlife medicine immediately catching Jake's attention. At 38, she'd left a lucrative private practice in Denver to work with wild animals, drawn by the same calling that had brought Jake to these mountains. Their shared evening conversations about animal behavior had slowly blossomed into something deeper, though neither had found courage to speak of it directly. The morning routine had seemed peaceful. Jake's radio chattering about minor incidents, tourists already gathering at popular overlooks despite the early hour. But something felt wrong. Python sightings near park boundaries had increased over recent weeks, and Jake's instincts, honed by 2 decades in the wilderness, whispered warnings he couldn't yet understand. He'd driven to Sector 7 expecting another quiet morning. Instead, he'd discovered his worst nightmare unfolding beside the creek where Sierra had learned to fish as a cub. Jake's boots hit the rocky ground before his truck fully stopped, adrenaline flooding his system as he grabbed his tranquilizer gun and emergency kit. The scene before him defied everything he knew about Yellowstone's ecosystem. Burmese pythons didn't belong here, couldn't survive the winters, shouldn't exist 3,000 miles from their native habitat. Yet here was an 18-foot monster, its diamond-patterned coils wrapped around Sierra's midsection like bands of living steel. Sierra's dark eyes found his across the 20 yards separating them, and Jake saw something that broke his heart. Recognition, trust, and desperate hope all mingled in that intelligent gaze. She was conscious but weakening fast, her breathing shallow and labored as the python's relentless pressure compressed her ribcage. Each exhale grew shorter, each inhale more desperate. Kodiak paced in agitated circles 30 feet away, his massive frame trembling with barely contained fury. The alpha male grizzly possessed the strength to tear the python apart, but his protective instincts warred with terrible knowledge. Any aggressive action might cause the snake to tighten its grip, crushing Sierra instantly. Jake had never seen such anguish in a wild animal's behavior. The big bear caught between the desperate need to act and the paralyzing fear of making things worse. "Easy, girl," Jake whispered, raising his hands slowly as he approached. "I'm here now. We're going to get you out of this." His voice carried the same gentle tone he'd used when bottle-feeding her as an orphaned cub, the sound that had taught her to trust humans when every instinct screamed to run. The python's head swiveled toward Jake, prehistoric eyes cold and calculating. This wasn't the lazy, well-fed demeanor of a snake that had recently eaten. This creature was actively hunting, deliberately aggressive in a way that seemed almost trained. Jake's 20 years of wildlife experience screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this scenario. He keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Chief, I need Dr. Ravenfeather and a full medical team at Obsidian Creek immediately. Also contact Fish and Wildlife. We've got an invasive species situation that shouldn't be possible." "Jake, what's your status?" Chief Windwalker's voice crackled through the static. "Sierra's in immediate danger. Large python, appears to be Burmese, actively constricting. I'm attempting intervention." Jake circled slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The tranquilizer gun held only 2 darts, enough sedative to drop a full-grown grizzly. But he'd never used it on a python. Would the dosage be too much? Too little? Would tranquilizing the snake cause it to release Sierra or squeeze harder in its death throes? That's when Kodiak did something extraordinary. The massive bear stopped pacing and looked directly at Jake, their eyes meeting across the clearing. In that moment, something passed between human and animal, an understanding that transcended species, a recognition of shared purpose. Kodiak chuffed once, a low rumbling sound, then positioned himself opposite Jake on the other side of the python. Jake's breath caught. The bear was suggesting cooperation, coordinated action. In 30 years of studying animal behavior, Chief Windwalker had never documented anything like this level of interspecies communication in the wild. "We do this together, big guy," Jake murmured, raising his tranquilizer gun. "You take the tail section, I'll handle the head. On my count." As if understanding every word, Kodiak tensed his powerful haunches, ready to spring. Sierra's eyes fluttered. She was losing consciousness, her body going limp in the python's coils. They had seconds before it was too late. Jake steadied his aim, finger on the trigger, and made a choice that would change everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and wild. "Now!" Jake squeezed the trigger as Kodiak launched himself forward with 800 pounds of protective fury behind him. The tranquilizer dart struck the python's neck just as the massive grizzly's claws raked across the snake's tail section, tearing through scales and muscle with surgical precision. The python's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Instead of loosening its grip, the enormous serpent constricted harder, its primitive brain interpreting the attacks as threats requiring maximum pressure. Sierra's eyes rolled back as her ribs compressed beyond their limit, a soft whimper escaping her muzzle, the sound of life being squeezed away. Jake's heart hammered against his chest as he watched his second tranquilizer dart arc through the morning air, striking the python's massive head. But the sedative would take precious minutes to work, and Sierra didn't have minutes. She had seconds. That's when Kodiak made a decision that would haunt Jake's dreams for the rest of his life. The great bear, seeing Sierra's distress reaching critical levels, ignored every survival instinct and wrapped his powerful jaws around the python's skull directly behind its head. It was a move of impossible bravery. Pythons were notorious for their unpredictable death throes, and Kodiak was placing himself in mortal danger to save his mate. The python thrashed violently, its muscular body whipping back and forth as it tried to dislodge the grizzly. Jake dove forward, grabbing onto the snake's midsection with his bare hands, adding his weight to the struggle. The serpent's scales were like armor beneath his fingers, slick with Sierra's saliva and surprisingly warm to the touch. For 30 agonizing seconds, the three-way battle raged beside Obsidian Creek. Jake's shoulders burned as he fought to unwrap the coils from Sierra's torso, inch by precious inch. Kodiak maintained his death grip on the python's head even as the snake's tail lashed across his flanks, leaving bloody gouges in his thick fur. Then, the tranquilizer began to take effect. The python's movements grew sluggish, its grip loosening as the powerful sedative flooded its system. Jake felt the coils relax enough to slip his hands underneath, supporting Sierra's weight as the snake's body went limp. Sierra collapsed onto the rocky shore, her sides heaving as she gasped for air. Jake's hands moved automatically to check for injuries, broken ribs, internal bleeding, damage to the cubs she carried. His fingertips found her pulse, weak but steady, fighting to stabilize after the crushing trauma. Kodiak released the python's head and immediately moved to Sierra's side, his massive frame trembling with adrenaline and concern. The big bear's muzzle was bloody from his battle with the snake, but his focus remained entirely on his mate. He lowered his great head to nuzzle Sierra's neck, making soft, chuffing sounds Jake had never heard from such a powerful predator. That's when Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. As he rolled the unconscious python onto its back to check for injuries, his fingertips detected a small, hard object embedded beneath the scales near the snake's neck. Years of veterinary training with Dr. Ravenfeather had taught him to recognize the feel of electronic implants. With shaking hands, Jake pulled his emergency scanner from his medical kit, a device used to read microchips in wildlife for tracking and identification purposes. The scanner beeped immediately when passed over the python's neck, displaying a registration number that made Jake's stomach drop. The readout showed, property of M. Kellerman Research Facility, specimen number 47B, Burmese python, restricted research use only. Jake stared at the scanner's display, his mind racing. Marcus Kellerman had been a respected wildlife biologist at Yellowstone until his termination 3 years ago following his son's death. Tommy Kellerman had been 19, drunk, and carrying an illegal firearm when he'd stumbled into grizzly territory during mating season. The bear attack that killed him had been defensive, natural, unavoidable, but Marcus had blamed the park's soft policies on predator management. More troubling, Jake remembered being the ranger who'd discovered Tommy's body and filed the incident report. He'd been the one to shoot the aggressive male grizzly in self-defense when the animal charged the recovery team. Marcus Kellerman had been in the crowd that day, watching as they loaded his son's body into the coroner's van, his eyes burning with hatred that Jake had mistaken for grief. The roar of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley as Chief Windwalker arrived with the emergency response team. But Jake's discovery had transformed a wildlife rescue into something far more sinister. This hadn't been a random encounter with an invasive species. This had been attempted murder, carefully planned and precisely executed. Someone had weaponized a python against Sierra, and Jake was beginning to understand why. Dr. Elena Ravenfeather's emergency medical team worked with practiced efficiency beside Obsidian Creek, transforming the rocky shoreline into an impromptu wildlife surgery suite. Sierra lay unconscious on a specialized transport stretcher, her breathing stabilized but concerning shallow. Elena's experienced hands moved across the bear's torso, palpating for internal injuries while monitoring equipment beeped steadily in the wilderness silence. 2 broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, Elena called out to her assistant. But the cubs are still moving. I can feel them responding to stimulation. Her Cherokee grandmother had taught her to read animal spirits through touch, and Sierra's life force still burned strong despite the trauma. Kodiak had positioned himself exactly 10 feet away, close enough to protect, far enough to avoid interfering with the medical team. The massive Grizzly's intelligent eyes tracked every movement, every procedure, as if memorizing the humans who were trying to save his mate. Chief Windwalker observed this behavior with professional fascination. In 3 decades of wildlife management, she'd never documented such sophisticated emotional intelligence in a wild predator. Jake knelt beside Elena, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elena, we need to talk privately. This wasn't an accident." He palmed the microchip scanner, making sure Chief Windwalker couldn't see the damning evidence it contained. Within an hour, Sierra had been transported to Yellowstone's Wildlife Medical Facility, a state-of-the-art clinic funded by conservation donations and federal grants. The building hummed with activity as Elena's team prepared emergency surgery to assess internal damage and ensure the cubs' safety. Kodiak had followed the ambulance the entire 5 miles, maintaining a steady pace beside the vehicle like a loyal escort. "He's not leaving," Elena observed as she scrubbed for surgery. Through the clinic's reinforced windows, they could see Kodiak settling into the parking lot, his massive frame curled protectively near the building's entrance. "Jake, in all my years of veterinary work, I've never seen wild animal behavior like this." Jake pulled Elena aside as her surgical team completed final preparations. The microchip scanner felt heavy in his pocket, loaded with evidence that would transform their wildlife emergency into a criminal investigation. "Elena, I found something on that python. Something that proves this attack was planned." Elena's dark eyes widened as Jake showed her the scanner's readout. "Marcus Kellerman. But he was fired years ago after—" Her voice trailed off as the implications sank in. "Jake, Tommy Kellerman's death. You were involved in that incident report." "I was the ranger who found the body," Jake confirmed grimly. "And I was the one who had to shoot the aggressive male when it charged our recovery team. Marcus blamed the park's policies, blamed me personally. He said we were too soft on predators, that Tommy died because we didn't eliminate dangerous animals preemptively. So he's using pythons to prove his point?" Elena's voice carried disbelief. "Creating artificial wildlife encounters to justify his position?" Jake nodded. "Think about it. Burmese pythons attacking grizzlies makes national news. Suddenly politicians are demanding answers about invasive species management, questioning whether our conservation methods are protecting the public. It's the perfect false flag operation." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Elena's assistant rushing from the surgical prep room. "Doctor, we need you immediately. Sierra's blood pressure is dropping, and we're detecting fetal distress. We may need to perform an emergency cesarean to save the cubs." Elena rushed into surgery while Jake contacted Chief Windwalker on secure radio. "Chief, I need you to run a quiet background check on Marcus Kellerman's current activities. Also contact Fish and Wildlife Enforcement. We may have a bioterrorism situation involving weaponized invasive species. Over the next 6 hours, Jake coordinated a dual operation, supporting Sierra's medical treatment while investigating the evidence trail left by the python attack. Chief Windwalker's contacts in federal law enforcement revealed disturbing information. Marcus Kellerman had been purchasing large reptiles through underground exotic animal dealers, claiming academic research purposes. "Jake, you need to see this," Chief Windwalker called from her laptop computer. She'd pulled up financial records showing Kellerman's recent bank transactions. "He's been receiving payments from something called American Heritage Development Corporation. They're a lobbying group that's been pushing for expanded commercial access to federal lands." Jake studied the financial documents, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. They want to build that resort complex in Hayden Valley. But they need to prove the area is too dangerous for public access first. Then, they can justify removing wildlife protections and opening the land for development. The conspiracy was more sophisticated than simple revenge. Kellerman's personal vendetta against Jake had been weaponized by corporate interests seeking to exploit Yellowstone's pristine wilderness. Each python attack would generate media coverage questioning park safety, building public support for policies that favored development over conservation. Elena emerged from surgery after 8 grueling hours, her face exhausted but relieved. Sierra's stable, ribs repaired, no major internal bleeding. The cubs are healthy and still developing normally. She's about 6 months along, due in early spring. Jake felt overwhelming relief wash over him, but Elena's expression remained troubled. "Jake, there's something else. During surgery, I found old scar tissue in Sierra's shoulder, bullet fragments from a small caliber rifle. She survived a shooting incident years ago, probably when she was very young." "That's impossible," Jake protested. "I found Sierra as an orphaned cub beside her mother's body. There was a snare involved, but no shooting." Elena shook her head. "These fragments are older than 8 years. Jake, I think Sierra might be the cub whose mother was killed by those poachers, the incident that brought you to Yellowstone in the first place." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His mother, Running Deer, had been gathering medicinal herbs in the Black Hills when poachers killed her. But the authorities had also found evidence of a wounded grizzly cub at that same location, a young bear they'd never been able to locate. "She's been carrying those bullet fragments her entire life," Elena continued softly. "Jake, I think Sierra's mother might have been protecting your mother when the poachers attacked. 2 mothers, trying to protect their young, both killed by the same men." Jake stared through the clinic window at Kodiak, who maintained his vigil in the parking lot. The connections felt too profound to be coincidental. His mother's death, Sierra's orphaning, their reunion at Yellowstone, and now this coordinated attack designed to destroy everything they'd built together. Chief Windwalker approached with urgent intelligence from her federal contacts. "Jake, we've got a problem. Kellerman isn't working alone, and the python attack on Sierra was just the beginning. Our sources indicate he's planning something much larger for tomorrow." "What kind of larger?" Jake demanded. "The annual Yellowstone Family Safety Tour, 300 visitors, including children, scheduled to visit Hayden Valley for educational programming about wildlife coexistence. If pythons attack tourists, especially children, it would generate enough public outrage to shut down our conservation programs permanently." Jake felt ice in his veins. Kellerman wasn't just targeting individual animals. He was planning a mass casualty event designed to destroy public support for wildlife protection. The man's grief over his son's death had been perverted into something monstrous, a willingness to sacrifice innocent families to prove his twisted point. "How many more pythons does he have?" Elena asked. Chief Windwalker's expression was grim. Financial records suggest he's purchased at least 12 large specimens over the past 6 months. We found evidence of temporary holding facilities near the park boundaries, but they've been abandoned. The snakes could be anywhere in the ecosystem by now. Jake made a decision that would define the rest of his life. We can't evacuate the tour without proof. It would cause exactly the kind of panic Kellerman wants. But we also can't let innocent people walk into a trap. "What are you suggesting?" Elena asked. "I'm suggesting we beat him at his own game. Tomorrow morning, Kodiak and I are going to be waiting in Hayden Valley. If Kellerman wants to use wildlife as weapons, he'll discover that some of us are willing to fight back." Elena grabbed Jake's arm. "That's insane. You're talking about using Kodiak as bait, putting yourself in mortal danger, and risking everything on the hope that a wild grizzly will cooperate with a human against an unknown number of deadly snakes." Jake looked out at Kodiak, still maintaining his protective watch over Sierra. "Elena, that bear just risked his life to save Sierra because he trusted me to do my part. Tomorrow, I'm going to trust him to do his." The decision was made. Tomorrow would bring either vindication of Jake's unconventional methods or a tragedy that would end his career, his life, and possibly the lives of hundreds of innocent visitors. Dawn broke over Hayden Valley with deceptive tranquility, mist rising from the Yellowstone River as the first tour buses began their approach along the winding mountain roads. Jake had been positioned since 4 a.m. with emergency equipment, tranquilizer rifles, and communication gear spread across his observation post on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley floor. Kodiak had arrived an hour later, emerging from the tree line as if summoned by some unspoken understanding between them. The massive Grizzly settled 30 yards from Jake's position, close enough for coordination but maintaining the respectful distance that preserved his wild dignity. Chief Windwalker monitored radio communications from the command center while Elena remained at the medical facility with Sierra, whose condition had stabilized overnight but still required careful observation. "Jake, first bus is 10 minutes out," Chief Windwalker's voice crackled through his earpiece. 347 visitors, including 86 children under age 12. Federal agents are positioned at perimeter points, but we still have no visual confirmation of python locations. Jake adjusted his binoculars, scanning the valley's tall grass and scattered boulder formations where large snakes could easily remain concealed. The Yellowstone Family Safety Tour had been scheduled months in advance, designed to demonstrate successful coexistence between humans and wildlife. Canceling without concrete evidence would validate Kellerman's message that the park was too dangerous for families, exactly the outcome his conspiracy required. "Elena, how's Sierra this morning?" Jake radioed to the medical facility. "Vitals are strong, cubs responding normally to stimulation. Jake, she's been restless since sunrise, like she senses something's wrong." "Animals have instincts we don't fully understand. Maybe you should listen to whatever Kodiak is trying to tell you." Jake studied the massive grizzly, noting subtle changes in posture and behavior. Kodiak's ears twitched constantly, rotating to catch sounds beyond human hearing. His massive head swiveled systematically, scanning terrain with the methodical precision of a military scout. Most telling, the bear had positioned himself between Jake's observation post and the trail where tourists would soon be walking, a protective formation that seemed intentional. The first tour bus rounded the final curve into Hayden Valley, its bright yellow paint cheerful against the mountain backdrop. Jake counted 43 passengers through his binoculars, mostly families with children clutching cameras and nature guides. A second bus followed, then a third, disgorging excited visitors onto the designated viewing area 200 yards from Jake's position. "Beautiful morning for wildlife observation," announced tour guide Rebecca Martinez through her portable speaker system. "Hayden Valley is home to grizzly bears, wolves, bison, and hundreds of other species that have learned to coexist with respectful human visitors. Our first stop will be the famous Obsidian Creek area, where rangers recently documented remarkable cooperative behavior between different animal species. Jake's blood chilled. The tour was heading directly toward the location where Sierra had been attacked, exactly where Kellerman would expect maximum symbolic impact. A python assault near Obsidian Creek would generate headlines linking the attack to Jake's dangerous wildlife management methods. That's when Kodiak did something extraordinary. The massive bear walked deliberately to a position directly between the approaching tourists and the creek area, then sat down in an unmistakably blocking position. He wasn't threatening the visitors, his body language remained calm, but he was clearly preventing their progress toward a specific location. "Jake, are you seeing this?" Chief Windwalker's voice carried amazement. "That bear is actively protecting those tourists." Through his binoculars, Jake watched tour guide Martinez stop her group, confused by the grizzly's behavior. Standard park protocol required maintaining 300 yards distance from any bear, but Kodiak had positioned himself in a way that made advancement impossible without violating safety regulations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martinez announced uncertainly, "we have a large male grizzly blocking our intended path. This is actually a wonderful opportunity to observe natural bear behavior, but we'll need to maintain safe distance and possibly adjust our route." Jake keyed his radio. "Chief, tell Martinez to keep the group exactly where they are." "Kodiak's trying to tell us something." That's when Jake spotted the first python, a massive shadow moving through the tall grass near Obsidian Creek, exactly where the tour group would have been standing in another 10 minutes. The snake was enormous, possibly 22 feet long and thick as a man's torso. Unlike yesterday's relatively lethargic specimen, this python moved with predatory purpose, actively hunting rather than lying in ambush. "Chief, I have visual confirmation. Large python, grid coordinates Alpha 7 Charlie, approximately where the tour was headed. Kodiak saved those people." Jake's radio exploded with activity as Chief Windwalker coordinated emergency response. Federal agents began moving toward the python's location while park rangers worked to discreetly evacuate tourists without causing panic. But Jake's attention focused on something more disturbing: movement in multiple locations throughout the valley. Through his high-powered scope, Jake counted at least 6 large pythons positioned at strategic intervals along the tour route. This wasn't random placement. Someone had carefully studied the scheduled itinerary and positioned deadly obstacles at every major stop. The level of planning suggested inside knowledge of park operations. "Jake, we've got a problem." Elena's voice cut through radio chatter. "I'm reviewing yesterday's security footage and I found something you need to see. Marcus Kellerman was here at the medical facility last night after visiting ours. He had access to our computer systems, possibly our scheduling databases." Jake felt pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place. Kellerman hadn't just released pythons randomly. He'd used stolen intelligence to position them with military precision. Every snake was placed to maximize casualties while creating the impression of a natural invasion that park rangers couldn't control. Kodiak suddenly stood and began moving toward the nearest python with purposeful determination. The great bear's stride carried lethal intent, but also calculated intelligence. He wasn't charging blindly, he was stalking, using terrain and wind direction to approach undetected. "Chief, Kodiak's engaging the first python. I'm moving to support him." Jake grabbed his tranquilizer rifle and emergency kit, abandoning his observation post to follow Kodiak toward Obsidian Creek. Behind them, federal agents worked frantically to locate and neutralize the remaining pythons before tourists noticed the unusual activity. The first confrontation was brutal and swift. Jake arrived just as Kodiak clamped his massive jaws around the python's neck, the same technique that had saved Sierra 24 hours earlier. But this snake was larger, stronger, and more aggressive than its predecessor. It coiled around Kodiak's torso with crushing force, threatening to squeeze the life from the brave grizzly. Jake fired 2 tranquilizer darts into the python's midsection, then threw himself into the struggle with his bare hands. The snake's scales were like armor, slick with morning dew and surprisingly warm to the touch. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, man and bear fought together against a creature that had no natural place in their ecosystem. When the python finally succumbed to the tranquilizer, Jake and Kodiak separated slowly, both breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. The grizzly's fur was matted with sweat and scratched from the snake's scales, but his dark eyes remained alert and determined. "1 down, 5 to go," Jake muttered, reloading his tranquilizer gun. But as they moved toward the second python's location, Jake realized they were walking into something far more dangerous than a simple wildlife emergency. Marcus Kellerman's revenge plot had evolved into a coordinated bioterror attack, with innocent families serving as unwitting targets in a twisted demonstration designed to destroy everything Jake believed about human-wildlife coexistence. The real battle was just beginning, and Jake understood with crystalline clarity that before this day ended, either Kellerman's vision of wildlife management through fear and elimination would triumph, or Jake's belief in cooperation and respect would be vindicated through actions that no bureaucrat could dismiss. Kodiak looked at him with those intelligent dark eyes, and Jake saw his own determination reflected back. They were no longer just ranger and bear. They were partners in a fight for the soul of wilderness conservation. "Let's go save some lives, big guy," Jake whispered, and together they moved toward the next confrontation that would determine the future of Yellowstone. The scream pierced through Hayden Valley like a blade, high and terrified, and unmistakably human. Jake's blood turned to ice as he realized one of the pythons had broken containment, moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Through his binoculars, he could see chaos erupting near the third tour bus. A massive Burmese python had emerged from tall grass and was stalking toward a family with 2 young children who had wandered from the main group. "All units, we have active threat at Bus 3. Chief Windwalker's voice crackled with urgency. "Python approaching civilians approximately 50 yards and closing." Jake was too far away, at least 200 yards from the unfolding disaster. Federal agents were repositioning but wouldn't reach the family in time. The python moved with terrifying speed through the grass, its massive body undulating toward 8-year-old Sarah Chen and her 5-year-old brother Michael, who stood frozen with terror as their parents screamed for them to run. Kodiak saw the situation before Jake could even radio for help. The massive grizzly exploded into motion, covering ground with the devastating speed that made his species apex predators. 800 pounds of protective fury launched across Hayden Valley, Kodiak's powerful limbs eating up distance as he raced to intercept the python before it reached the children. Jake sprinted after him, his lungs burning as he tried to keep pace with a creature built for this kind of emergency response. Behind them, tourists scattered in panic while park rangers worked desperately to maintain order and prevent stampedes that could injure more people than the python itself. The collision was catastrophic. Kodiak slammed into the python's midsection with the force of a freight train, sending both massive animals tumbling through the grass in a deadly tangle of fur, scales, and raw violence. The snake immediately coiled around Kodiak's torso, seeking to crush the bear's rib cage with the same constricting power that had nearly killed Sierra. But this time was different. This time, Kodiak had backup. Jake arrived as the python's head reared back to strike at Kodiak's exposed neck. Without hesitation, Jake threw himself between the snake's fangs and the bear's throat, using his own body as a shield while firing his tranquilizer gun point-blank into the python's skull. The snake's reflexive strike caught Jake across the chest, 23 needle-sharp teeth tearing through his ranger uniform and into the flesh beneath. Pain exploded through his torso as the python's bite delivered not venom, Burmese pythons weren't venomous, but devastating trauma from teeth designed to grip struggling prey. Jake screamed, but held his position, emptying his tranquilizer gun into the python's head and neck while Kodiak worked to break free from the crushing coils. The grizzly's claws raked across the snake's scales, tearing through muscle and sinew with surgical precision born of millions of years of evolutionary perfection. Federal agents reached the scene as the python's movements began to slow from the massive dose of tranquilizer. Agent Rebecca Torres fired additional sedative darts while her partner worked to pull Jake clear of the dying snake's reflexive thrashing. "Jake's down!" Torres shouted into her radio. "We need medical evacuation immediately!" Jake lay on his back in the grass, his chest on fire from the python's bite wounds. Through blurring vision, he watched Kodiak shake off the loosened coils and lumber toward him, the great bear's dark eyes filled with something that looked remarkably like concern. "I'm okay, big guy," Jake gasped, though blood was soaking through his torn uniform. "Did we save them? Are the kids safe?" Agent Torres knelt beside him, applying pressure to the worst puncture wounds. "The children are fine, Jake. You and that bear saved their lives." But even as emergency medical teams rushed toward their location, Jake could hear Chief Windwalker's voice on the radio coordinating responses to multiple crisis points throughout the valley. "We have 3 more python sightings, all moving toward tourist concentrations. All available units respond immediately." Jake struggled to sit up despite Torres's protests. "Chief, how many more are out there?" "Unknown, but at least 3 confirmed large specimens still active." "Jake, we're going to lose people if we can't locate them all." That's when Jake realized the horrible truth. Kellerman's plan was working perfectly. Despite their heroic efforts, despite Kodiak's unprecedented cooperation, despite federal law enforcement response, they were fighting a battle designed to be unwinnable. Every minute the crisis continued, every injured tourist, every terrified child would become ammunition for politicians demanding the elimination of wilderness protections. "Elena," Jake radioed weakly to the medical facility. "How's Sierra? Can she travel?" "Jake, you're injured. You need medical attention, not—" "Elena, answer me. Can Sierra travel?" Elena's voice carried reluctant understanding. "She's stable enough for short-distance movement, but Jake, what are you thinking?" Jake looked at Kodiak, who stood guard over him like a massive, furry sentinel. The bear's intelligent eyes seemed to understand that their fight was far from over. "I'm thinking," Jake whispered through gritted teeth, "that Kellerman underestimated what a real family will do to protect each other." Jake's world tilted sideways as Agent Torres helped him into the emergency medical vehicle, his chest wrapped in blood-soaked bandages that did little to stop the burning pain from the python's bite. Through the ambulance's rear window, he watched Kodiak following at a steady lope, the massive grizzly's loyalty transcending every instinct that should have driven him back to the safety of deep wilderness. "Jake, you've lost a lot of blood." Elena's voice came through his radio as she monitored his vital signs remotely. "You need immediate surgery to clean those puncture wounds and repair the muscle damage. Some of those teeth went deep, dangerously close to major arteries." But Jake's attention focused on the tactical radio chatter filling the ambulance cabin. Federal agents were reporting python sightings across multiple sectors of the park, each more aggressive than natural behavior should allow. The snakes weren't just hunting randomly, they were actively seeking human contact, pursuing families with children in patterns that suggested deliberate conditioning. "Chief, this isn't natural predator behavior," Jake gasped into his radio. "Someone's trained these pythons to associate humans with food. They're not just invasive species, they're living weapons." Chief Windwalker's response crackled with fury and disbelief. "Jake, we found Kellerman's base camp 2 miles north of Hayden Valley. You need to hear this recording we discovered." The audio quality was poor, but Marcus Kellerman's voice came through clearly. "Phase 3 implementation begins at dawn. Target priority: families with children under 10 years old. each successful encounter will generate maximum media impact. The American people will demand immediate predator elimination policies once they see what coexistence really costs. Jake's blood chilled as he understood the depth of Kellerman's madness. This wasn't just revenge for his son's death. It was a calculated psychological warfare campaign designed to destroy public support for wildlife conservation through televised trauma involving children. The ambulance reached the medical facility just as Elena burst through the emergency entrance, her surgical team already prepared for trauma surgery, but Jake grabbed her arm as they prepared to wheel him inside. "Elena, Sierra needs to be part of this. I know it sounds insane, but Kodiak's been trying to tell us something. These attacks aren't random, they're coordinated. And if Kellerman's using intelligence and conditioning to turn predators into weapons, maybe we can use intelligence and cooperation to stop him." Elena stared at Jake as if he'd lost his mind from blood loss. "You're suggesting we bring a recovering grizzly bear into an active combat situation? Jake, Sierra just underwent major surgery. She's in no condition for—" "Elena, listen to me." Jake's voice carried desperate urgency. "Kellerman's plan depends on proving that wildlife is uncontrollable, unpredictable, dangerous to families. But what if we prove the opposite? What if we show that intelligent animals can be trusted partners in protecting human life?" Before Elena could respond, chaos erupted outside the medical facility. A massive python, the largest yet encountered, had emerged from the nearby forest and was moving directly toward the building where Sierra was recovering. This specimen was easily 25 feet long, its girth suggesting a weight approaching 300 pounds. Kodiak saw the threat immediately. The grizzly positioned himself between the approaching snake and the medical facility's entrance, but Jake could see through the window that this python was different from the others. Its movements were more coordinated, more purposeful, and its massive head swayed with the hypnotic rhythm of a creature that had been trained for exactly this kind of confrontation. "It's heading for Sierra," Jake realized with horror. "Kellerman knows she's here. He's using the largest python to finish what the first one started." Elena made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of sedating Jake for surgery, she helped him to his feet and supported his weight as they moved towards Sierra's recovery room. If you're right about animal intelligence and cooperation, then Sierra deserves the chance to defend herself and her cubs. Sierra was awake when they entered her room, her dark eyes alert despite the medical equipment monitoring her vital signs. The moment she saw Jake's bloodied condition, she struggled to rise from her padded recovery bed, maternal and protective instincts overriding her own physical limitations. "Easy, girl," Jake whispered, approaching slowly with Elena's support. "I know you're hurting, but we need your help. Kodiak's out there fighting for all of us, and he needs his family." Through the reinforced windows, they could see the titanic struggle unfolding in the parking lot. Kodiak had engaged the massive python, but this creature was stronger and more aggressive than any they'd encountered. The snake's coils wrapped around Kodiak's midsection with crushing force, while its massive head struck repeatedly at the bear's neck and shoulders. Sierra saw her mate in mortal danger and made a choice that defied every medical protocol, every safety regulation, every assumption about wild animal behavior during recovery from major surgery. She rose from her bed, ignored Elena's protests, and walked deliberately toward the facility's emergency exit. "Sierra, no!" Elena called, but the grizzly was already moving with purpose that transcended human understanding. Jake leaned heavily against Elena's shoulder as they followed Sierra outside. The bear moved stiffly, her surgical sights obviously painful, but her determination was absolute. She approached the python-Kodiak struggle with the calculating intelligence of a predator who understood exactly what needed to be done. The massive python had gained advantage over Kodiak, its superior length allowing it to maintain crushing pressure while avoiding the bear's most dangerous weapons, his claws and jaws. But the snake hadn't anticipated fighting two opponents simultaneously. Sierra attacked with surgical precision, targeting the python's head while Kodiak controlled its body. Her claws raked across the snake's skull with devastating effect, opening wounds that immediately began weakening the creature's grip on her mate. Jake watched in amazement as the two bears coordinated their assault with the tactical sophistication of a military unit. They communicated through subtle body language, adjusted their positions to maximize effectiveness, and protected each other's vulnerable areas with seamless cooperation. "Elena, are you recording this?" Jake gasped. "The world needs to see what's possible when humans stop trying to control nature and start learning to work with it." The python released Kodiak and attempted to escape into the forest, but its injuries were too severe. The massive snake collapsed 20 yards from the medical facility, its aggressive conditioning finally overcome by the coordinated defense of creatures fighting to protect their family. As federal agents secured the scene and emergency medical teams checked both bears for injuries, Jake realized that Kellerman's plan had backfired catastrophically. Instead of demonstrating wildlife's danger to human families, the day's events had proven that some bonds transcend species barriers and that trust, cooperation, and love could triumph over even the most sophisticated weapons of fear and hatred. But Jake's satisfaction was short-lived. As Elena helped him back toward the medical facility for desperately needed surgery, Chief Windwalker's voice crackled through his radio with news that turned victory into impending tragedy. "Jake, we found Kellerman, and he's not finished yet." Marcus Kellerman emerged from the tree line like a specter of grief transformed into something monstrous, his weathered face twisted with 3 years of festering hatred. He carried a high-powered rifle and wore tactical gear that suggested military training, but his eyes burned with the unhinged intensity of a man who had lost everything that mattered and decided to take the world down with him. "It ends here, Thunderheart." Kellerman's voice echoed across the medical facility parking lot, carrying the raw pain of a father who had never recovered from watching his son's body loaded into a coroner's van. "My boy died because of your soft policies, your dangerous belief that wild animals can be trusted. Today, I prove what predators really are." Jake struggled against Elena's supporting grip, his chest screaming with pain from the python bite wounds, but determination overriding his physical limitations. Sierra and Kodiak flanked him protectively, both bears sensing the threat this human represented to their unusual family unit. "Marcus, your son's death was a tragedy," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "But Tommy was drunk, armed, and trespassing in Grizzly territory during mating season. The bear that attacked him was defending her cubs, exactly what any parent would do." Kellerman's rifle swung toward Sierra, and Jake's blood turned to ice. "These monsters killed my only child, and you've spent 3 years teaching them to trust humans so they can kill more efficiently. Watch me prove what your cooperation is really worth." The rifle crack split the mountain air with devastating finality. Sierra's massive body jerked as the bullet tore through her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the asphalt. Blood spread across her fur in a growing crimson stain, and her cubs, 6 months developing in her womb, were suddenly at risk from trauma that could trigger premature labor or worse. Kodiak's roar of fury shook windows in the medical facility as the great bear charged toward Kellerman with 800 pounds of protective rage behind him. But Kellerman had anticipated this response, had planned for it, had dreamed of this moment for 3 years. The second shot caught Kodiak's center mass, the high-powered round designed for large game hunting. The massive grizzly stumbled, his charge faltering as blood began soaking through his thick fur. But incredibly, impossibly, Kodiak kept moving toward the man who had wounded his mate and threatened his family. "Stop!" Jake screamed, throwing himself between Kellerman's rifle and the approaching bear. Marcus, this isn't justice. This is murder. These animals trusted us, and you're proving they were wrong to do it. Kellerman's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter sound of a soul that had died with his son. Trust. Your precious Sierra is bleeding out on the pavement, Thunderheart. Your loyal Kodiak is dying from internal bleeding. Where's your cooperation now? Where's your interspecies harmony when it really matters? Elena had already rushed to Sierra's side with emergency medical supplies, her hands working frantically to control the bleeding while monitoring for signs of fetal distress. "Jake, she's losing too much blood. The cubs are in immediate danger." That's when Jake understood the full depth of Kellerman's twisted revenge. The man hadn't just wanted to kill the bears. He wanted to force Jake to watch them die slowly, to experience the same helpless agony Kellerman had felt watching his son's life slip away in a hospital room 3 years ago. "You want to know what really happened to Tommy?" Jake shouted, his voice breaking with exhaustion and grief. "I was there, Marcus. I held your son's hand while he died." His last words weren't about the bear that attacked him. They were about how sorry he was for disappointing you. How he'd only been drinking because he couldn't handle the pressure of living up to his father's expectations. Kellerman's rifle wavered for the first time, doubt creeping into his eyes. "You're lying. Tommy told me he'd been struggling with depression for months, that he felt like a failure because he couldn't make you proud. He went into those woods drunk and armed because he thought maybe if he brought home a trophy bear, you'd finally see him as a man instead of a disappointment." The words hit Kellerman like physical blows, and Jake pressed his advantage. "Your son died because he was trying to prove himself to a father who was too obsessed with being tough to notice his boy was drowning in despair. The bear didn't kill Tommy. Your inability to show love and support did." Kellerman's face contorted with rage and pain as the truth carved through 3 years of carefully constructed blame. "No! It was the bears. It was your policies. It was you," Jake said quietly. "Just like this is you. Just like destroying innocent animals because you can't face your own failures as a father is you." The rifle shot that followed wasn't aimed at the bears. Kellerman turned the weapon on himself, the final act of a man who had spent 3 years running from guilt that could no longer be denied. The sound echoed across Hayden Valley like thunder, final and absolute. But the tragedy wasn't finished. As Kellerman's body collapsed to the asphalt, Jake realized with horror that Sierra was going into premature labor. The trauma of being shot, combined with the stress of the confrontation, had triggered contractions that could kill both her and her cubs if immediate action wasn't taken. "Elena, we need emergency surgery now," Jake called, ignoring his own wounds as he helped support Sierra's massive weight. "The cubs are coming whether we're ready or not." Kodiak, wounded but refusing to abandon his family, positioned himself protectively around Sierra, as Elena's medical team transformed the parking lot into an impromptu surgical theater. Federal agents secured the scene while park rangers worked to establish a sterile field around the laboring bear. "Jake, I need you to help keep her calm," Elena called as she prepared emergency cesarean equipment. "Your voice is the only thing that might keep her still enough for me to save the cubs." Jake knelt beside Sierra's massive head, his hands gentle on her fur as he spoke in the same soft tones he'd used when bottle-feeding her as an orphaned cub. "Easy, girl. Remember when you were little and I used to read you stories about brave mama bears who protected their babies? Today you get to be that mama bear. Today you get to be the hero." Sierra's dark eyes focused on Jake's face, and for a moment the chaos of surgery faded into something deeper. A connection between human and animal that transcended the violence that had brought them to this moment. Elena worked with the speed and precision that had made her one of the country's leading wildlife veterinarians, her hands moving inside Sierra's body to deliver cubs that were arriving 6 weeks too early. The first cub emerged silent and still, but Elena's massage and stimulation finally triggered the tiny heartbeat that meant life. The second cub was stronger, crying immediately upon delivery, a sound that brought tears to every human present and seemed to give Sierra the strength to continue fighting for her own life. Two healthy cubs, premature but viable, Elena announced as she worked to control Sierra's bleeding. "Jake, she's going to make it. They're all going to make it." Kodiak approached slowly, his own wounds serious but not life-threatening. The massive bear sniffed his newborn cubs with infinite gentleness, then looked at Jake with an expression that seemed to carry gratitude too profound for words. Chief Windwalker arrived as Elena finished suturing Sierra's surgical wounds. "Jake, federal investigators found evidence that Kellerman was working with development interests planning to build a resort complex in this valley. Your documentation of human-wildlife cooperation was threatening their timeline for proving the area too dangerous for conservation protection." Jake nodded wearily, unsurprised by the revelation. "They turned a grieving father's pain into a weapon against everything we've been trying to build here." But as he watched Sierra nuzzling her newborn cubs while Kodiak stood guard over his recovering family, Jake realized that Kellerman's ultimate failure hadn't been tactical or strategic. It had been a failure of imagination. The man had been so consumed with proving that wild animals were dangerous that he'd never considered the possibility that they might also be capable of love, loyalty, and trust. The bear family that had emerged from this tragedy was living proof that cooperation between species wasn't just possible. It was the foundation for a future where humans and wildlife could share the same world without one destroying the other. As the sun set over Yellowstone, painting the sky in shades of healing gold, Jake understood that the real victory wasn't just that they'd survived Kellerman's attack. It was that they'd demonstrated something beautiful enough to change hearts and minds for generations to come. 6 months later, Jake Thunderheart stood at the edge of Obsidian Creek, watching Sierra teach her cubs how to fish in the same waters where their story had nearly ended in tragedy. The morning sun painted golden ripples across the surface as two healthy bear cubs, now the size of large dogs, splashed awkwardly through the shallows while their mother demonstrated the patient techniques that would keep them alive through countless seasons to come. Kodiak lounged nearby on a sun-warmed boulder, his massive frame showing only faint scars from the wounds that had nearly cost him everything. The great bear's dark eyes tracked every movement of his family with the vigilant care of a father who had fought too hard for this peace to ever take it for granted. When one cub strayed too far from shore, Kodiak's low chuff brought the youngster scrambling back to safety with the kind of gentle authority that spoke to bonds deeper than instinct. "Look at them," Elena whispered, her hand finding Jake's as they observed from their respectful distance. 6 months ago, we weren't sure any of them would survive. Now they're teaching us what recovery really looks like. Jake's chest still ached occasionally from the python bite wounds that had required 3 surgeries to fully repair, but the deeper healing had come from watching this family rebuild itself despite everything Marcus Kellerman had tried to destroy. The cubs had been named by popular vote among park visitors. Hope and courage seemed fitting for bears whose very existence challenged assumptions about the relationship between humans and wildlife. Dr. Ravenfeather, the documentary crew is ready for your interview, called Rebecca Martinez, the former tour guide who had become the park's new director of wildlife education. The success story of Sierra's family had attracted national attention, with major networks competing to tell the story of unprecedented cooperation between humans and wild animals. Elena squeezed Jake's hand before walking toward the camera crew, her role as lead veterinarian making her the scientific voice of their conservation revolution. Jake remained by the creek, preferring to let others handle the media attention while he focused on the quiet daily work of building trust with creatures who had every reason to fear humans. Chief Sarah Windwalker approached with the satisfied expression of a woman whose final years of service had been vindicated by results no bureaucrat could dismiss. "Jake, the Secretary of the Interior wants to meet with you next week. They're considering making the Thunderheart Protocol official policy for all national parks." The Thunderheart Protocol, named despite Jake's embarrassed protests, represented a fundamental shift in wildlife management philosophy. Instead of maintaining rigid separation between humans and animals, the new approach recognized that some creatures possess the intelligence and emotional capacity to form cooperative relationships with respectful humans. The documentation from Sierra's case had provided scientific foundation for approaches that prioritized understanding over control. "Any word on the federal investigation?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer from Chief Windwalker's expression. American Heritage Development Corporation collapsed once their connection to Kellerman's bioterror plot became public. 3 executives are facing federal charges, and the proposed resort development has been permanently banned from this valley. Sometimes justice takes a while, but it does eventually show up. Jake nodded, watching Hope successfully catch her first fish under Sierra's proud supervision. The cub's triumph was celebrated with playful wrestling that sent water splashing across the creek banks, a moment of pure joy that erased the memory of blood and violence that had once stained this same location. "Chief, do you ever wonder if we're anthropomorphizing their behavior, reading human emotions into animal actions?" Chief Windwalker smiled, her weathered face crinkling with the wisdom of 6 decades spent observing wildlife. "Jake, I've been watching animals longer than you've been alive, and I've never seen anything like what Sierra and Kodiak have shown us. Whether we call it love, loyalty, or just complex instinctual behavior doesn't matter. What matters is that it works, for them and for us." Elena's interview with the documentary crew had attracted a small crowd of park visitors, families with children who had come specifically hoping to glimpse the famous bear family. Jake watched parents explaining the story to wide-eyed kids who listened with the rapt attention children reserve for tales of adventure and triumph. "Mama, why did the bad man want to hurt the bears?" asked a little girl, whose innocent question carried the weight of humanity's oldest moral challenge. Her mother knelt down, choosing words carefully. "Sometimes people get so hurt and angry that they forget how to see good things anymore. But the ranger and the bears showed us that love is stronger than anger, that families protect each other no matter what." Jake felt tears stinging his eyes as he realized the true victory wasn't legislative or scientific. It was generational. These children would grow up with a different understanding of the relationship between humans and wildlife, shaped by stories of cooperation rather than conquest. A park ranger approached with news that made Jake's heart skip. "Mr. Thunderheart, we have a situation developing near the north entrance. A black bear cub appears to be orphaned, and it's not responding to standard wildlife protocol. The mother was hit by a vehicle 2 days ago." Jake looked at Elena, who was wrapping up her interview, then at Sierra, who had noticed his change in posture and was watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. The female grizzly chuffed once, a sound Jake had learned to interpret as encouragement, or perhaps permission. "Chief, I need to go help that cub," Jake said, the decision feeling as natural as breathing. "Take Elena with you," Chief Windwalker replied. "And Jake, take your documentation equipment. Something tells me this isn't the last family you're going to help rebuild." As Jake and Elena prepared to leave for the north entrance, Kodiak rose from his boulder and approached the creek's edge where they stood. The massive grizzly stopped just outside arm's reach and performed the gesture that had become his signature farewell, placing one enormous paw briefly on the ground between them, a bridge of trust that needed no words to convey its meaning. Sierra herded her cubs toward Jake for what had become their ritual goodbye. Hope and courage approached fearlessly, their mother having taught them that this particular human represented safety rather than threat. The cubs sniffed Jake's boots with the curiosity of creatures who would grow up in a world where such interactions were possible. "See you soon, family," Jake whispered, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As they drove toward their next rescue, Elena reached across the truck's cab to take Jake's hand. "Do you realize what we've started here? This isn't just about one bear family anymore. It's about proving that the world can be different if we have the courage to trust each other." Jake thought about his mother, Running Deer, who had died 25 years ago gathering healing herbs in the sacred Black Hills. She had believed that all living things were connected, that humans had a responsibility to protect rather than exploit the natural world. Her death had brought him to Yellowstone seeking healing, but her teachings had shown him how to find hope. "Mom always said that every ending is also a beginning," Jake said quietly. "I think Sierra and her cubs are the beginning of something beautiful." Behind them, Obsidian Creek continued its eternal flow toward the Yellowstone River, carrying the reflected image of a bear family that had learned to trust, humans who had learned to listen, and a future that held room for both wildness and love. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun like liquid hope, flowing toward tomorrow with the quiet confidence of those who have seen miracles emerge from the darkest moments. In the distance, mountains stood eternal and patient, witnesses to the ancient truth that Jake Thunderheart and his unlikely family had rediscovered, that love truly knows no boundaries, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest conservation victory is simply proving that trust can be stronger than fear. The story that had begun with violence and hatred had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of choosing hope over despair, cooperation over conquest, and love over everything that would tear families apart. Dear friends, this story reminds us that even in our golden years, we have the power to build bridges where others see only walls. Like Jake Thunderheart, many of us have learned that true strength comes not from controlling others, but from having the courage to trust and be trusted. Whether we're grandparents teaching patience to restless grandchildren, neighbors helping newcomers feel welcome, or simply choosing kindness when the world feels harsh, we carry the wisdom to show younger generations what love in action really looks like. The bond between Jake and Sierra's family proves that families come in all forms and that the love we give to children, animals, or community creates ripples of hope that reach far beyond what we can see. Every day offers us choices between fear and trust, between building walls and building relationships. What family bonds, human or otherwise, have shaped your understanding of unconditional love? How has your life experience taught you that patience and trust can overcome even the darkest challenges? Share your stories in the comments below. Your wisdom matters more than you know,